They're launching counterattacks there. Yeah, using those 40,000 troops. So of the 100,000 troops right now, as of September 10th, 71,000 of them are casualties. That doesn't mean they're all dead, but it means they're either dead, they're wounded, they're crippled, they're blind, they're out of combat. 71,000 out of the 100,000 are gone, along with all of their equipment. In the city of Poltava in Ukraine, the military commissar responsible for mobilization has come out and said, out of every 100 men that we mobilized, 80 to 90 of them are gone.
Jeez.
80 to 90 are gone. This is what's happening here. And people want to somehow believe that this is a success. The Russians have given up trivial amounts of land. The Ukrainians had not reached the first line of defense. And remember, after the first line of defense is the second line of defense, and the third line of defense, and the fourth line of defense. Ukrainians haven't reached the first line of defense. They're still in the forward defensive area, what I call the crumple zone, designed to absorb the attack, and they've lost everything.
Yeah.
This war is over. Ukraine is done. They can't accomplish what they say they need to accomplish. Again, going to that box shows the axis of advance, the ideal axis of advance. So you go from that blue pocket, you go down south. There's a village called Tokmak. They were supposed to have captured that 2 months ago. They have not come back. Their final objective is Mariupol at the bottom. Melitopol, at the bottom there. They were supposed to capture Melitopol, and that would sever the land bridge to the parts that held by Russia. That's continental part. Going down further south is Crimea. You sever the land bridge, you isolate Crimea, and you have the fantasy of recapturing Crimea. This was the goal. This is why they built up these forces. They haven't come close to accomplishing that. They are stuck in the low ground near Robotyno, being slaughtered by the Russians.
And for all you out there, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever see the movie The Rock, the SEALs come up from underneath the ground. They're going to try to go back and take the away from the Marines. Ed Harris had them, and they saw them coming, and all the Marines were up on top, and all the SEALs were trying to come up from the bottom, and Ed Harris told them, like, we have you. We're on an elevated ground. It almost sounds like what you're talking about over here, that this is the low ground in which they're trapped and there's no way for them to go. You said the absorption zone. Is that what you're kind of referring to over there, where the Russians are so... Because, Scott, there's this argument out there, there was this narrative that was put out in the beginning of this war, that the Russian military is just a bunch of sloppy idiots. They're not trained well. The Ukrainians have had, Blackwater training them, and a lot of weaponry, and they're much harsher fighters. Can you provide a little insight to that when you talk about this high ground and this low ground, this absorption zone?
Well, what's important to note is that this defensive barrier here is representative. It's standard. It's an adaptation of standard Soviet defensive doctrine that has been in part of the Russian military since the end of the Second World War. But it was adapted when the Russians went into Ukraine early on. And they began fighting the Ukrainians. I think everybody realized that everything people thought they knew about modern war, throw it away. That modern war is far more lethal, far more dangerous, far more bloody and violent than anybody had imagined. It's not me saying that. General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, spoke at Oslo in January to a NATO defensive forum, and he said just that. The scope and scale of the violence is beyond our imagination. We couldn't consider what is going on here. If you can't imagine it, you can't prepare for it. And so even Russia, I think, was taken a little aback on it. It doesn't mean that they're bad soldiers. The Russians are very adaptable. There was a general named Alexander Romanchuk, and he was the deputy commander of the 58th Combined Armed Army that was doing a lot of the fighting down there in the Zaporizhia area. He was pulled out of the fighting and sent to the Combined Arms Academy, where he rethought Russian defensive warfare, reconceptualized it, and he wrote a new manual. He actually published an article, which I read about it. He explains this. And it redefined Russian defensive doctrine. And then they pulled him out of the academy, and they put him in charge of building the defense. Guess where? Right there, right in that box. He's the man who built the defense. And it is, and even General Miley, all the Americans are going, wow, this is a pretty good defense. We can't crack this defense. Why? Because the Russians are pretty damn good at what they do.
Yeah.
And remember, the people manning this aren't the regular soldiers of the Russian army that were fighting at the beginning of the war. These are regular soldiers combined with the mobilized, the reservists, the ones that we're told don't want to be there, don't want to fight. Yeah. In addition to them, there's 300,000 volunteers. I'll give you a little story. I have a friend that lives in St. Petersburg, and he was talking about how many of these skilled professions, when we say skilled, there's a book called Outliers, and they said before you become an expert, you need to spend 10,000 hours doing something. So a skilled professional, an artisan, it's a guy probably in his late 20s, early 30s, who spent 10 years perfecting a skill, in woodworking or something like that. They said in St. Petersburg, there's no more skilled professionals. Why? Now, these are people who are making a good living, a damn good living. People who don't need to go to war. They're of the age where they're probably married, they have young children. Why are there no skilled professionals in St. Petersburg? Because they've all volunteered to go to war to defend their country. Yeah. 300,000 of them have volunteered, trained. There was a famous video, become famous, that showed one tank. They called it the kamikaze tank. Alyosha is the name of the tank. And it charged against 8 Ukrainian vehicles, 2 tanks, 6 armored fighting vehicles, destroyed them all. The composition of that tank crew, 1 professional soldier, 1 volunteer, and 2 mobilized. The idea here from the Western perspective is that the Russians didn't want to fight, don't want to fight. They don't want to be there.
Yeah.
I'm here to tell you right now, every Russian serving on the front line wants to be there, is committed to winning this war, and is willing to give their life in service of their country. And that's the fact. These Russians are led by the finest officers in the world. General Romanchuk, he could outclass any American general right now. So can all the other Russian generals. Their officers are very well trained. Men are well trained, well equipped, well led, motivated. Ukrainians aren't even going to come close to defeating these guys on a battlefield.
That's, Scott, I believe you. I really do.
Sean Penn believes you. Yeah, that's why he wants more money.
Well, listen,
Sean Penn has concluded the same thing.
Casualty adverse, right? Then we can go back to that story.
Penn. Sean Penn said they're not really winning. Be honest. Give them all your money. That's
the thing. He was implied we should commit like NATO troops. That caution.
Take it up to World War III.
Caution will turn into cowardice. But it's kind of funny because I've questioned this whole story with a presidential candidate who was kind of read off a story where they said all these Russians are being arrested because they're protesting fighting in the war and they wouldn't fight in the war, and there's hundreds of thousands of them in jail. This is the opposite of what you're saying, Scott, that these people want to go to war. They want to fight for their country. And I do believe you when you say these things, because I think it's bullshit to say the opposite. They understand what's going on, the existential threat.
Also, what makes people stop wanting to fight for the country, because I'm sure plenty of Ukrainians want to fight for the country, is just getting thrown into a meat grinder and it's a death sentence just getting into it.
Well, let's talk about that, Scott, because you did mention something here. That was the Russian side. The Russians, you're reporting that they want to go to war and fight. It's almost like after 9/11, so many people in America joined up to fight for their country. I think the same thing while there's a threat in our border. So I've always believed that, and I've always believed the rhetoric of them getting arrested for not wanting to fight was just propaganda for the Americans, right? Okay, let's talk about the Ukrainians. Not a day goes by that we don't see on Twitter or Instagram Ukrainian soldiers showing up at somebody's house, beating the shit out of them, throwing in a van, and take them to the front line for the meat grinder. You just said right over here, almost 8 out of every 10 soldiers at this point for this counteroffensive has either been injured or hurt or dead or killed. What's going to happen now? Because, the Americans can give long-range missiles, different types of weaponry that might not be helpful on the front line, but striking from a distance. But we've heard stories that there's close to 500,000 now Ukrainian soldiers dead. What are they going to do moving forward to fight this war? They're going to run out of troops. What's going to happen? Is it just sooner or later this is endgame now?
Yeah, here's the thing. The Ukrainians have a large army, a very large army. And at the beginning of this war, there was a very large, well-trained army. NATO had been training Ukrainian forces from 2015 up until the very start of this conflict. Training them to NATO standards. And so these are well-motivated, well-led troops. Not all of them are Nazis. In fact, the Nazis, the nationalists, are actually a distinct minority at the start of the war. Now, many of these guys were suffered. I mean, an elite unit, the elite special forces unit of Ukraine, their commander said sometime in the summer of 2022, he said, I've lost 80% of my men. 80%. These are the best. These are men that were trained to NATO standards. When they would have training exercises with NATO, the NATO forces, our guys, special forces, Green Berets were going, these guys are pretty damn good. They're really top of the game. Well, 80% of them are gone. And you know how long it takes to train a highly qualified special forces operator? Years. Instead, they're replacing them with fresh recruits out of basic training who don't have the skill set, but they're being asked to do the same thing. And so they're dying even quicker. The same thing with the rest of the Ukrainian military. They go in, they were well motivated, they fought very well, but they're taking casualties, lots of casualties. And like I said, by the beginning of summer 2022, the original Ukrainian army had been decimated, eviscerated. Their troop of huge casualties. So they're replacing them. But they're replacing them with people that want to fight, people that are volunteering, saying they want to fight. They're motivated. They show you the extent, the idea that the Ukrainians are somehow incompetent is absurd. The courage that these Ukrainian soldiers are displaying in going into the Russian defenses. You know how much balls, excuse my language, but the balls it takes to advance into that kill zone there in Robotyno?
How much?
It's more balls. It's more balls than most Americans have. I'll tell you that.
Okay.
Most Americans would turn and run. The Ukrainians are going into that, being slaughtered, and they keep advancing. Being slaughtered, and they keep advancing. So they have huge brass balls. In the battle for Bakhmut, when Wagner was in there doing the fighting, the head of Wagner, Prigozhin, before he died, told a story about how the Wagner troops went in and surrounded about 20 Ukrainian soldiers in a building. And the Ukrainians had no chance. They were surrounded, and the Russians said, "Hey, brothers, surrender. Surrender. We'll treat you well. We're not going to hurt you. We're going to come out and all that stuff." You know what the Ukrainian soldiers yelled back? Russians don't surrender. You see, they're Russians. They know they're Russians. Russians don't surrender is a line from the Second World War, a very famous line when the Germans surrounded a Russian officer. He said, "Russians don't surrender," and he blew himself up with a hand grenade. These Ukrainians that are fighting the Russians are the same damn people as the Russians fighting the Ukrainian. The same people with the same courage, the same tenacity, the same will to sacrifice for their country. They're just dying for Ukraine. The problem is all of these brave Ukrainian soldiers have died for their country. What's left are people that don't want to fight. And so you have to mobilize them. Remember, there's still a lot of Ukrainians on the front line that want to fight for their country. But the numbers are reducing. You need to replace the gaps in their lines with these new troops. They don't want to be there. They're being hijacked they're being given 21 days. And it's not that they don't want to be there because they're cowards or because they don't believe in Ukraine. They don't want to be there because they're not getting any training. They're not getting any experience. They're just being thrown straight into the meat grinder. That's why, because when they get to the front line, these are troops that, had they been trained properly, been given good leadership, given a modicum of hope to survive on the battlefield, might perform as admirably as everybody else. But when you arrive on the battlefield, confused, you don't know who your commander is, you have only a handful of bullets for your gun, you don't even know how to shoot the gun properly, and then you're told to go fight the Russians, and what the Ukrainians are all saying is, the Russians are pretty damn good.